What is good, gamers, drainers, and John Stamos impersonators? I'm Karsten Craning, back with another video today, and today we're going to be talking about Yoji Yamamoto. Yoji is one of the most compelling and influential designers in history, and to simply cover his whole history in one video is impossible. So today we're going to be talking about one specific season. I want to preface this video though by talking about why I'm making it. A couple of months ago, Bliss Foster released a video called The Yoji Yamamoto Problem. In this video made by Bliss, he believes that Yoji's work cannot be analyzed because it's too avant-garde in a way. And I don't agree necessarily with Bliss Foster's take on Yoji Yamamoto, and respectfully, I would like to add to the conversation about Yoji. Part of the problem for Bliss is because of the sources he uses to do his research, as well as his analysis style, where he doesn't really take context in account all the time. I want to make it clear, I don't blame Bliss, and it is significantly harder to analyze Yoji because getting correct information is not easy. Also, Bliss's analysis philosophy is that he doesn't look at context, he just looks at the clothes themselves. And simply, me and Bliss just differ on these points, whereas I look at context and he does not. Again, this is not an all-encompassing guide to Yoji, but I think context is super important when looking at any designer. So let me first give you the best picture I can of who Yoji Yamamoto is. So Yoji Yamamoto was born in 1943 in Japan. He never knew his father because he died in World War II, and he was raised solely by his mother. Initially, his mother wanted him to be a lawyer, but instead he decided to follow in his mother's footsteps and become a dressmaker. In his early life, he began traveling around the world, from the United States to Italy, as well as studying at the Bunka Fashion School. He eventually set up shop in Tokyo and began making clothes for women. Yoji's philosophy on making clothes is that he has always believed that God, in the Shinto context, has been willing him to make clothes. Now, that little asterisk of in the Shinto context is very important. Shinto is a Japanese religion which focuses on ancestor worship as well as nature spirits. And that is a gross underrepresentation of a whole very rich religion. However, what is important in this idea is that we are pushed on by our ancestors to honor them. Now, it's important to note Yoji's father, of course, died in World War II. He never knew him. Yoji's father was drafted and was in the war against his own will, and Yoji feels as if a lot of his work is to continue on this expression that his father never had. A quote from Yoji about his father and his fellow soldiers who died in World War II was, "I think I'm working for them to express what they could not. I feel I am given a task to do something for them. In that sense, what I've been doing is merely accidental. I feel that I have been pushed along. When I consider all of those, I might often think that I'm not just fighting for myself, but this continuation of something else." Yoji, growing up, always felt that his clothing design was not necessarily all of himself, but being pushed on by his ancestors, and in this case, his father. Yoji growing up in post-war Japan is also not something to gloss over. One of the trademarks of Yoji's clothing is that it's oversized, it's drapey, it's bulky. Yoji has stated that one of the reasons for that is he is compensating as a smaller person as a result of malnourishment growing up, and that is one of the reasons his clothes seem to be oversized or bigger and drapier. Yoji's art often has to do with the real world and becomes his reactions and feelings to what's going on. It's not art that necessarily exists in a bubble, and that's very important to note about his work, is that there is some art which seems to kind of be in a world of its own and isn't as affected by what is going on, while Yoji's art is very reactionary and is very much his own feelings to what is happening. Now, something to note about Yoji's designs is that they do have a Japanese inspiration or ethos to them. The kimono is an important basis for many of Yoji's designs. A well-known quote that has been taken out of context time after time again is where Yoji says, "He is not a Japanese designer." This quote is cited absolutely everywhere, that Yoji is not a Japanese designer. And if there's something important I want you to get from this video, it is that context matters. When Yoji said this quote, he was responding to journalists who would box him in as a Japanese designer when he first debuted in Paris. He was making a statement on how his art went beyond his race and was for everyone, not on his own inspiration behind the clothes themselves. Yoji has said in other interviews since then that he is indeed inspired by Japanese culture in his designs. One of the easiest ways to see how Japanese design has influenced Yoji in particular is how Yoji has stated that many of his designs focus around the neck and the nape of the neck of a woman. How a design alters the appearance of the neck is thought about in Japan as a sign of attraction or seduction. In Europe, it is more about the shoulder and the chest that kind of goes into that attractiveness, seduction. Yoji has often talked about how he wishes to disrupt the Western ways of looking how garments play with attractiveness or beauty and wants to move towards the Japanese. This type of rejection of the Western perspective of beauty came as quite a shock to journalists when Yoji and Rei came to debut their collections in Paris. Yoji and Rei, however, became two of the most influential designers in the past 50 years. Many of people's favorite fashion designers, such as Andy, Rick Owens, and Martin Margiela, were all heavily inspired by their work. While they may have been shocking and influential in a good way, many of the journalists heavy critiqued their work because it was so different from everything else going on at the time. Many of the journalists put Yoji and Rei in this box of these weird Japanese people who create ugly clothing. And if you read between the lines of a lot of the Western reporting or criticism on Yoji and Rei at the time, there's definitely some racism in between those lines. Many of those journalists were also not familiar with Japanese garment history, and they didn't care enough to look into it, besides labeling it Japanese or avant-garde. And while those facts are correct, it's a lot more nuanced than just simply Japanese and avant-garde. For your average Westerner, it is always going to be harder to understand Yoji's work unless you have an adequate understanding of traditional Japanese clothing construction and history, which most people don't. This is somewhat kind of the problem that Bliss addressed with a lot of Yoji Yamamoto's early work. Much of Western journalism, which is available, still suffers from this racial ignorance. I think it's worth noting that Yoji has a heritage of designing for 40 years. He has designed way more than Rick Owens, Carol Christian Poel, or any other designers that are sometimes in these conversations. On the internet, designers like Rei, Yoji, and Issey don't necessarily have all of their histories recorded. Even a lot of the retrospects you will find are pretty bad, so I'm going to link a couple down below that I think are actually pretty good and helpful when learning about Yoji. However, in Japan, where Yoji is from, there's a lot more information and analysis. That information on those early collections is not available on the internet. The information is in magazines, and to get that information on the internet, there are collectors who are buying those magazines and then translating them. This is where I'd like to give a huge plug to my friend Etienne. He is an expert on Yoji Yamamoto, Rei Kawakubo, and Issey Miyake, and has been working on translating a lot of this material so we can actually get adequate analysis and information on a lot of these collections. He has a YouTube, a Patreon that you guys should go 100% support. I'll link him down in the bio. And you guys should 100% go support it because then he can create adequate content to actually give you an understanding of these designers. I'm asking you guys to support him is because it does take legitimately a lot of money to hunt down these resources and get them translated. So thank you to Etienne for helping me make this video. I thought the best way to counter Bliss's point that a Yoji collection could not be analyzed was to actually analyze a Yoji collection. I chose one of my favorite collections, Spring/Summer 2002. So let's get into it and let's actually analyze a Yoji collection. So here is Yoji. His debut in Paris was almost 20 years ago. Much of his signature style and how he has designed has become a lot less shocking. He's well established, and while there are perks with that, of course, one thing he is noticing and he is seeing is his clothes are getting worn on the street specifically less and less. and Yoji can feel himself at the cusp of being irrelevant. It's a fear that any successful artist has to deal with at some point. However, Yoji wants to capture the youth once again. In his own words, Yoji wanted to see his clothes on the street, and to do this, he wanted to capture some of the current trends and what he saw, as well as let this collection be some sort of rebirth. One of the ways he captured this rebirth was by working with Sayako Tsurama again. You may be familiar with her work appearing on Yoji pieces before, particularly in Autumn-Winter 1991. 2002 in many ways is the daughter collection of Autumn-Winter 1991. Sayako's work in that collection has an underlying theme to war in it. That collection is all about war in many ways. Her art is very reminiscent of wartime imagery such as pinups used during World War II era. And the idea with her art being used in that collection was this idea of the traditional man going to war for the woman on his back. And this was used by Yoji as a response to the Gulf War, which was happening at the time. War is obviously one of Yoji's themes that he plays with, and he is very reactionary to it. Sayako's work, however, in this collection doesn't have any dark underlying tone to it. If Autumn-Winter 1991 is World War II, the art used in this collection is brought to bring some sort of post-war optimism. The generation coming out of ruins, the art is more reminiscent of that in the 50s, where there's this hope that the next generation would somehow be better than the last. The prints themselves are of Japanese movie stars, while in 1991, Sayako made the pieces of art directly for Yoji. In 2002, Yoji took these prints out of her archive. These prints were actually made for a TV special to commemorate these actresses in 1990. These are Showa period actresses such as Ayako Wakao and Ineko Arima, butchered those pronunciations, I'm sorry, whose pictures were taken and then airbrushed over by Sayako to give the effect of popular magazines of the 1950s. They also resemble the aesthetics of some Ozu films, which are an important thing to note. Yoji is communicating that he is shifting to a new period in his work, one of less strife and where he is focused on addressing the next generation. Yoji described this collection as almost romantic, as if he was romanticizing and perhaps projecting his own hopes of what he wanted this next period of the world to look like. When Yoji was making this collection, it was on the cusp of the internet boom as well as rave music. Technology was rapidly evolving, and this was affecting art and music greatly. Yoji harnesses this energy with these CGI rave prints. Many times these are referred to as the acid or LSD shirts, but it's meant to be a reflection of instead Y2k youth culture at the time. Y2k culture had been around prior to and around 2000 and the early 2000s, and its aesthetics are very easily recognizable. Rave culture was also huge in the 90s, and electronic music would play a huge role in music going further. Another thing to note is the characters on these shirts, which were again done by Sayako. These are supposed to be reminiscent of cartoon characters in the 1950s, like Betty Boop, but with their own kind of futuristic spin as they are done in CGI. It's another case of romanticizing and an embrace of the new generation and their own new kind of futuristic art. The clothes themselves are a far cry from what we would consider a normal Yoji collection. While Yoji is playing with boxy, oversized silhouettes that he is known for, he's a lot more playful and humorous than usual. While Yoji often has some sort of playfulness or humor in his work, there's also a cynicism and darkness which isn't present in this collection. It's a lot more lighthearted. Bright colors and the aforementioned Y2k prints bring some sort of carefree atmosphere to it. This paired with the prints of Sayako's work gives it almost a retro modern feel. Almost kind of like the style of the future in Back to the Future 2. Yoji is also using denim in this collection, which is rare but not the first time he has used denim. This is notable, however, because this was purposefully a reflection of the youth trends at the time. Denim was popular in Paris with the kids, and Yoji wanted to add to that conversation with his own twist. The color palettes are, of course, a lot more brighter and colorful, and these color palettes are also done in a way to be in sort of a correspondence to what is happening in Paris, such as what Martin Margiela is doing at Hermes. One of the biggest things that Yoji saw about the people on the street that inspired him when he was making this collection is he saw so many kids in running shoes. And so he called Adidas and asked to make shoes with him, and they would begin on this collaboration between Yoji Yamamoto and Adidas. The shoes would officially release the year before, just as things worked out, and you can actually see it coming down the runway on some of those looks. However, this season is also important because it goes beyond shoes. While there are models wearing those Adidas collaborations, you're also finding some Adidas into the designs of the clothes themselves. For example, if you look closely, you'll see that the three stripes incorporate themselves in some of the designs of the clothes themselves. This would be an extremely important moment for Yoji because Y3 would go down as one of the most influential streetwear lines of all time. I know so many people whose entry into fashion was Y3, and that line holds such an importance to the youth, I think, and youth culture. You could call this collection Yoji's love letter to the youth of the late 90s and early 2000s. He creates this playful world for them, which they're kind of free from the tides of war and worry, where they're able to invest themselves into the art and culture of the time, where technology allows for a new, bizarre world of expression. The world is as bright and fun as these clothes in Yoji's mind. Yoji inserts so much more romantic hope in this collection that you can't but help think of this as a wardrobe for some bizarre parallel worlds. Y2k Dystopia. For a designer like Yoji Yamamoto to create such a hopeful collection, when usually his work is kind of filled with a bit of dread and nihilism, and war has definitely influenced his clothes for a long time, it's a very special moment in Yoji's career where there is some freedom from that. Bringing this back to the context of Yoji's father, a lot of his work has been influenced by war and this kind of pain of losing his father in war. And he always kind of has had to express this pain through his clothes. It's one of these special moments in Yoji's career where he's actually channeling this hope. And it's as if his father is giving him this kind of feeling that maybe the world will be all right for once, and there's no need to worry. Perhaps this generation is the one that will actually change things. Also to state, this is again the 90s and early 2000s, right when the Cold War ended. There's no longer this like looming threat that nuclear war could happen at any day, and I think that definitely plays into something of why Yoji might have this hope all of a sudden. However, if we bring it back to the context of the world, we know that this dream would be nothing more than a dream. Less than a year after the showing of this show, 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror would shock and scar this generation. The idealization and hope for what the world would be like for this generation would quickly crumble as the dangers of technology and globalization would become apparent. Yet this Yoji collection stands as a reminder of what could have been. A past dream of hope which has quickly faded as the harsh pangs of reality set in. It's sometimes hard to remember this type of hope that there was for the world, especially in times like these, and that's what makes this art so important. Because lest we forget hope, we have then lost everything. Thank you for watching this video on Yoji Yamamoto and one of my favorite seasons from him. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and yeah, thanks for watching.